In the previous part, The Destruction of the Old World, we explained how social conditions changed abruptly as a result of a cataclysmic event, be it a natural disaster or a war, or both, loosely between the early 18th and the late 19th century. This event is also known as the Reset. The Industrial Revolution was one of the most obvious consequences of this reset. After the disappearance of the Old World, a power vacuum arose that was exploited by a small power elite to disempower the old kingdoms. They divided the world among themselves through imperialism and the establishment of modern nation-states. In the course of industrialization, the invisible ruling powers were faced with the challenge of convincing the masses of their secret plans. The world exhibitions were created as a way to reach this goal. In all likelihood, these exhibitions were created to introduce certain technologies into society, or rather, to reintroduce them. Great Exhibition, London, Great Britain, 1851. The London Crystal Palace Exhibition was the first prominent worldwide industrial exhibition. A whole 28 countries with a total of 17,062 exhibitors on a total area of over 80,000 square meters took part and received about 6 million visitors in 6 months, a quantity comparable to about 1/3 of the total population of Great Britain at that time. To appreciate the full scale, it is necessary to imagine that the gigantic glass house, fitted with cast iron frame elements, was estimated to be 3 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral or 4 times the size of St. Peter's Basilica. In total, it is said 4,000 tons of iron were processed for columns, trellis girders, and gutters, and about 153,000 square meters of glass were produced. 80 glaziers are said to have installed 18,000 panes in 1 week, and more than 5,000 workers are said to have been employed on the building during the construction phase. A civil engineer remarked about the Crystal Palace,
"I'm a civil engineer, and I consider the construction of the Crystal Palace in 39 weeks from approval to opening to be complete nonsense. The glass they apparently had to use is cylinder glass, measuring 1.25 by 0.25 meters, which was very labor-intensive. It had to be blown in a trench, cut, and then polished. So the glass alone would have been impossible to make in the 4 months given. About 153,000 square meters of glass, with no machinery, just horses for power. You couldn't make it in 39 weeks today, let alone in 1850.
Add to this the fact that simple automation processes for the mass production of glass did not develop until 30 years later. So everything had to be produced by hand, and the distance from the glassworks in Smethwick to Hyde Park, where the Crystal Palace was originally built, was around 209 kilometers. And as if all this wasn't fantastic enough, the Glass Palace was completely dismantled after the exhibition and then rebuilt in a larger form in Sydenham Hill and used as a museum there. To bring visitors to the London exhibition site, 2 stations were newly built, both confusingly called Crystal Palace and differing only in their underground and overground locations, respectively. The fire that destroyed the Crystal Palace in 1936 made the high-level station virtually redundant, which is why it was eventually demolished. The beautifully tiled subway, supposedly built by Italian masons and stonemasons, however, survived. Incidentally, parliamentary buildings made of wood and plaster were erected especially for the Festival of the Empire, which was one of the largest single events in London's Crystal Palace and took place on 12th May 1911. These buildings were also intended to be used only temporarily and were connected by an electric tramway, the so-called all-red route. For example, the replica of the Canadian and New Zealand Parliament buildings, the former visible on the left in the foreground of the Crystal Palace. On November 30th, 1936, however, the Crystal Palace fell victim to a devastating major fire. Michelle Gibson writes about this.
We learn that the Crystal Palace was moved to Sydenham Hill in South London in 1854 and rebuilt, and that it was later destroyed by fire in 1936. How did they manage to move a massive building made of glass panels and cast iron 3 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral in London to another location? The New York Crystal Palace was also destroyed by fire, but much earlier than the London Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace in New York burned down in 1858, apparently in front of a large audience.
In an article that takes a closer look at these events, it states,
500 firefighters and 90 fire trucks were needed to put it out, and another 749 police officers to control the crowds. Witnesses described, quote, so much molten glass that it looked like a waterfall, even like a Niagara Falls of molten glass. According to one eyewitness, the glass actually caught fire, and when it was really hot, there was a sodium flame, and the molten glass poured straight down. Mrs. Ford from Sydenham described, hot molten glass and metal flowed down the street, and adults formed a human chain and passed buckets of water from hand to hand to stem the flow of hot glass. Another witness recalled that people picked it up and rolled it into balls to keep as souvenirs. However, the 2 towers of the palace are said to have remained standing, even deformed by the fire. The flames were accompanied by clouds of sparks and violent explosions. The reference to the explosions, by the way, is noted only in a few records.
The fire burned with great intensity all night. Even 20 hours later, there were reportedly still pockets of fire. The British press considered the destruction of the Crystal Palace a serious blow to the political power of England, and the public wondered how steel and glass can burn so fiercely. It is important to know that in glass production, the raw materials are heated to about 1,600 to 1,800 degrees Celsius, but finished glass can melt between 600 and 800 degrees Celsius. Cast iron, when compared with other alloys, has a relatively low melting point of around 1,150 degrees Celsius. But the question is where the temperature should have come from and whether furnishings would already have been sufficient to generate heat of this magnitude. Incidentally, there has never been an official investigation into this incident, and the fire is still considered unsolved to this day. Chicago World's Fair, USA, 1893. On May 1, 1893, the city of Chicago held the World's Columbian Exposition to celebrate the discovery of America by Columbus 400 years earlier. In fact, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago was to be the largest to date. 70,000 exhibitors from 46 nations were present, 25,000 of them from the USA alone, to present their technical achievements, marking the beginning of a new era. Not only a film projector, the first dishwasher, a fully electric kitchen, an elevated train with electric drive, and a rolling footbridge could be marveled at, but also the amusement park with fairground stalls, circus performers, artificial ice rinks, and an 80-meter-high Ferris wheel attracted numerous visitors. The organizers of the fair
hoped to demonstrate the great industrial might of the United States and symbolize the transfer of leadership from the old world to the new,
which, given the historical background, may have been a coded message as well, except that the term Old World may mean something different than what we learn nowadays. The Chicago Expo, which makes us think involuntarily of ancient Rome, was nicknamed White City, and was the inspiration for the Emerald City in the book The Wizard of Oz. Here is one of the sketches that illustrator W.W. Denslow made in response to the Chicago Expo for The Wizard of Oz. The tops of the domes are studded with crystals, hence the name Emerald City in the book. Here, Denslow stands against the backdrop of the Expo site after the devastating fire and on the verge of complete demolition. Interestingly, Indian researcher Praveen Mohan describes in his videos that many ancient Indian temples were originally studded with crystals at the top. Some, like the Somawathiya Pagoda, still have those crystals today. Does The Wizard of Oz contain an unconscious collective memory of humanity? Or did Denslow possibly know something that is no longer available to us today? In any case, the Chicago World's Fair was one of the most impressive exhibitions ever in architectural terms. According to the story presented to us, over 200 buildings were built on the shores of Lake Michigan on an area of 278 hectares in only 3 years. Paradoxically, the construction period coincides with the period of economic depression, and the Panic of 1893 was the most severe economic crisis in the history of the United States to date. Who would have thought that in such a time there were enough workers and resources to build an almost paradisiacal city? Were these buildings actually designed by architects Daniel Burnham and Frederick Law Olmsted and meant to be understood as a homage to Greco-Roman architecture? Or did some of them already exist before the Expo began? Were they showing the public the remains of the old world one last time, only to destroy them afterwards? Considering the immense effort that was necessary to construct the buildings, the official explanation hardly seems plausible, especially since there are only a few photos of the construction phase, or precise records of the course of the complex construction projects. This discrepancy between the functionality of the building as an exhibition object and the effort of construction is most evident in the colossal Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building. This 200-mile-wide and 500-mile-long building required twice as much steel as the Brooklyn Bridge and was 4 times the size of the Roman Colosseum. It may even have been one of the largest buildings ever built, covering an almost unimaginable area of about 20 football fields. This huge building housed numerous items from manufactories around the world that supposedly represented the level of technical expertise that had emerged since industrialization. This construction alone would have taken years and consumed numerous resources, even if you believe the official narrative of a temporary building. Nevertheless, the building was completely demolished after the Expo. Of the more than 200 buildings, 14 had similar dimensions to the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts building, and they too were almost all destroyed after the 130-day duration of the exhibition. Today, only 2 buildings remain: the so-called Museum of Science and Industry and the World's Congress Auxiliary Building. Considering the high effort of the construction, the question arises why only 2 of these buildings were allowed to remain standing, since other possible uses would have been quite conceivable, and it sounds very unbelievable that such immense resources were simply wasted. The following photo purportedly shows the construction of the administration building. A photographer told us about this.
Without access to the originals, it is difficult to say whether the image here is a true photograph. In this version, however, a pencil drawing was clearly applied. My professional opinion is that all the pictures I have found of this building have been altered in some way. None of these pictures can be used as evidence that the building is under construction. In my opinion, the photos indicate restoration rather than construction, based on the anomalies marked in the photo.
He further notes that the following photos of the construction process are contradictory.
Both photos are presented as evidence of the construction of the building. First of all, I would like to give you a short hint and emphasize that both pictures are misleading in their presentation. In the right picture, the dome appears to be completely finished, while in the left picture, it is clearly not. But in the right photo, the smaller domes that are at each corner of the central part of the building are missing, while in the left photo, with the dome still incomplete, the smaller domes are present. The construction process in the right photo appears to be almost complete. So why would these smaller domes be missing?
Another interesting building at the Columbia Exposition was the main train station on the Expo grounds, whose entire rail system consisted of 35 tracks. By comparison, the main station in Munich, one of the largest stations in Germany, has only 34 tracks. Allegedly, the entire station was only temporary in nature, but it begs the question of how it would even be possible to build a station in such a way that it was stable and functional, but still temporary in nature. The only photo of the alleged construction of the station building shows a building already completely finished amidst mud. It appears to have been nothing more than freshly painted. Of the construction process itself, according to our research, not a single photo exists. A few months after the expo, the station burned to the ground along with other buildings at the exhibition. Cause of the fire? Arson by unknown. The official story is this. A security guard at the expo, conveniently called C. Mason, noticed the fire in the casino and also immediately tried to sound the alarm. Unfortunately, none of the 5 devices to activate the fire alarm worked, which he tried out in quick succession. Fortunately, he eventually found a phone, so he was finally able to report the fire. By then, however, it was already too late, and due to changed official procedures, only 10 fire trucks were able to arrive at the scene instead of the usual 20. It is also possible that this fire and subsequent demolition shortly after the expo ended is related to the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. There are some contradictions with this fire. Officially, the cause of the Great Chicago Fire was that a cow knocked over a lantern. Evidence for this theory was never presented. Were the remains of the old world destroyed here in 2 phases? First with the city fire that claimed the lives of some 17,500 buildings, and later with the demolition of the expo site? Were there even 2 separate fires? Were there fires at all? Questions upon questions. Supposedly, by the mid-19th century, Chicago had rapidly developed from a small Indian settlement into the huge metropolis we know today. But again, there is no documentation of the logistics of city planning. Interestingly, Chicago appears with the name Chilaga on old maps. So was this possibly an important Old World city? And was Chilaga deliberately renamed Chicago to obscure its history? If we look at the White City of the Expo mentioned earlier from this point of view, the area could in fact have been a government district of Chilaga that was converted to a modern expo area. So, did the 27 million people who visited the exhibition actually witness the destruction of one of the last parts of Chilaga? The Statue of the Republic, which was on display at the Chicago World's Fair, holds in its right hand a sphere on which an eagle with outstretched wings is enthroned, while its left hand adorns a staff with a Phrygian cap, which was a symbol of the Scythians, or Tartars, and presumably symbolized freedom and justice. In the course of the Age of Enlightenment, the Phrygian cap continued to be used as a symbol of freedom. Significantly, in the same year that the Chicago Expo was being planned, the new University of Chicago was founded, considered one of the most important private American university foundations of the era, generously supported by oil magnate John D. Rockefeller. And this very university bears in its coat of arms a griffin burning in fire, in which one could also recognize a symbol for the destruction of the Old World Empire. Some symbols, such as the double-headed eagle, the mythological griffin, the quadriga, i.e. four-horse, and the lion we encounter again and again in the context of the Old World. Louisiana Purchase Exposition, St. Louis, USA, 1904. The Louisiana Purchase Expo, also known as the St. Louis World's Fair, was twice the size of the Chicago Expo and consisted of more than 1,500 buildings connected by roads and trails over a length of 121 kilometers. Only 2 buildings are said to have been solidly and permanently built, while all the others were demolished immediately after the Expo. The whole thing was financed with more than $15 million at a time when St. Louis was in economic distress and its citizens were plagued by corruption, poverty, and dis-ease. The planning of the Expo itself was also overshadowed by several cases of corruption. The first $5 million was provided by the city of St. Louis through the sale of municipal bonds. Another $5 million was raised through private donations from interested citizens and businesses throughout Missouri. The final $5 million came in the form of funds that were part of a congressional appropriation bill passed in late May 1900. In the end, the Expo made a loss of $8.5 million, the equivalent of more than $250 million today. But if there was no financial incentive for the Expo, what was the point? On the official Expo website, we can read,
"As the majority of the pavilions were built to be temporary, few legacies remain today. However, the Palace of Visual Arts still stands in its place and now serves as the Museum of Arts of St. Louis, one of the largest art museums in the United States."
The Missouri Exposition Pavilion, as the largest and most impressive building, was supposed to have been preserved for future generations, but it burned down barely 2 weeks before the end of the Expo on November 18, 1904. As it was said, a reconstruction was therefore renounced. The site was also home to the world's largest organ and dome at the time.
The Festival Hall was another staple of the Expo in St. Louis, featuring the largest dome in the world at the time. The building featured 3 water cascades draining into the Fountain of Liberty, which was adorned with statues personifying liberty, the largest of the statues, genius, and inspiration.
The approximately 4.9 square kilometer fairgrounds used for the World's Fair were located on what is now Forest Park and the Washington University campus, and it was the largest fair area in the world at that time. The total construction time was less than 3 years, and the Palace of Agriculture alone took up a staggering 81,000 square feet. It was said to be impossible to get even a glimpse of everything in less than a week. More than 19 million people are said to have visited the Expo at that time. Remarkable, considering that St. Louis had only 500,000 residents back then. One observer of the World's Fair noted at the time that the streets of St. Louis were full of life, more so than any other city in the North. George Kessler was the architect of the Expo. But, oddly enough, there is a popular myth that says Frederick Law Olmsted actually designed the fairgrounds. There are hundreds of photos of the alleged construction process of the Expo, and of course, various buildings were indeed newly constructed for the Expo, especially the trashy structures that lack the classicist aesthetic. Existing structures also appear to have been outfitted with obviously primitive, tasteless decorations. However, the photographs purporting to show the construction process of the grand, impressive classical exhibition palaces may as well have been made during the demolition. Historian Dr. Robert Archibald says about the St. Louis Expo,
"The fair planners had a contractual obligation to demolish the fairgrounds and return Forest Park to sort of a predetermined lands. They were legally obligated to do that. The problem on the Pike was they were all concessionaires and everything they had set up was all theirs. They couldn't sell it for anything. The costs of demolition were greater than the value of what there was to salvage."
This defies all economic logic and only makes sense if there was a secret agreement between the city and the industrialists. They had to erase all traces of the expo against any natural economic impulse of these entrepreneurs who always strive to maximize profits. The story we are being served up is almost perfect, but on closer inspection we see that it has been reversed. Thus, pictures of the demolition were probably simply declared to be shots of the construction process, and the photos of the empty site after the demolition are now sold to us as photos taken before the construction. The digitized archive photos are in all likelihood a mixture of authentic, real new buildings, demolition photos, and manipulated photo collages.